Good morning, diamonds of the earth. Welcome and welcome back to my channel. I know I've been making a ton of videos on the Bridgerton series, but I can't help but find other instances that I believe would be useful to potentially explain away some of the things I found irritating about this season, because there was a few. One of those irritations that will be mentioned in this video is the lack of garden metaphors mentioned within this season. I have a video where I touch on the use of frames in Bridgerton's Queen Charlotte, in which I mention the use of gardens as well. If you haven't seen it, then I will have a link up there, probably on this side, where I delve into this further, and you can check it out for yourselves. So in today's video, I wanted to delve into the symbolism of the garden as a site of passion a bit further and explain how the Bridgerton series, specifically the third season, this most recent one that we got, seems to have completely negated the entire symbolic value of the garden, and it has instead kind of replaced it or just gotten rid of it altogether. I don't think there's really a replacement for it. Mainly it's just that they got rid of it completely. So if this is the type of video that you might enjoy, I would just ask that you sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of this video. So for a little context, the official description of the garden as a site of passion comes from Lady Bridgerton, Lady Violet Bridgerton, in Bridgerton's Queen Charlotte. She and Lady Danbury are promenading with one another inside of a museum. I don't think promenade is a good use of that term. I think it's just like they're observing some art within a museum. And Lady Danbury is noticing that Violet's acting a little strange compared to normal, and she is very persistent in inquiring of why she's acting so different. Eventually, Lady Bridgerton comes out and finally gives in and lets Lady Danbury know through metaphors that her garden is in bloom. The reason why I'm choosing to speak on the symbolism of gardens within this season is due to its consistent reference throughout the entire series of Bridgerton, from the first season all the way until the Queen Charlotte spin-off show. All throughout the season, all throughout the series, the gardens have been depicted as sites of passion for forbidden pleasures being explored and pleasures being awakened. This third season, however, it appears to be the only season that truly does not correlate the two, but rather it explicitly leaves out the symbol altogether. The reason why I'm choosing to speak to the symbolism of the gardens within the season is due to its consistent reference throughout the entirety of the show, all the way back from season 1 all the way up until Queen Charlotte's spin-off show. All throughout the Bridgerton series, gardens have been used or depicted as sites of passion for the forbidden pleasures being explored and the pleasures finally being awakened. This third season, however, they don't have any correlation of the two, but rather they explicitly choose to leave out the symbol altogether. Now, there could be some argument to say that the scene where Penelope and Colin share their first kiss is a place where their passions are ultimately aroused, as it was, or at least it appears to be, located within the Featherington Garden. However, I would argue that it's not passion that is awakened in this scene. Instead, I would say that it is possessiveness on Colin's side that is sparked, and it is persisted throughout the series until he and Penelope finally get married, to which that entire passion scene is completely disregarded, thrown out the window, and we are ultimately led with the further Lady Whistledown story. I have an issue with this scene for a number of reasons. The first reason being, unlike other times where it is obvious that we're in a garden setting whenever this passion is being explored, with this scene specifically, it's not really clear, at least for myself, that it was in a garden. As even with Colin's dream that he had, we can tell that he's walking through like a path of a garden, but then it's not really clear. For the most part, you really just got Penelope standing in like that doorway, the concrete doorway, before they ultimately give in and they start kissing each other and all that stuff. The other issue I have with this is that when it comes to the relaying of this passion, it is so far from the other examples that we've had throughout the series. And I'm going to draw back on this in the next section, but I'm going to be analyzing each passionate scene that is gone through. So we're going to start off with Daphne and Simon. And then we're going to go with Kate and Anthony. And then afterward, we're going to we're going to go to Kate and Anthony. Then we're going to go to the Queen and King George. And then we're going to go to Penelope and Colin. And we're going to kind of like see how these depictions of passion, although they vary for Colin and Penelope, theirs is like completely disregarded. So let's set the stage for this first section, which is the passionate scene between Daphne and Simon. So Daphne, she just ran out of the ballroom. She went into the the Queen's garden, and she is breathing heavy. She's very frantic. She rips that necklace off because she feels like it is suffocating her. So she rips it off so she's able to breathe officially now. Simon follows after her and is inquiring of her to see if she's okay. She says yes, of course, and basically really insinuates or really emphasizes the fact that she's going to be married to a prince, so there would be no reason why she would be upset. And Simon doesn't believe her. So in this moment of pure anger, she ends up rushing into the garden of the Queen in hopes of getting away from Simon. Simon pursues her. He finally catches up to her and turns her around. And it is that moment that they officially begin to awaken their passion for one another by giving in to their desires, by giving each other a kiss. In this scene is so distinct. I think it's very important because this is emphasizing that this is the first scene where they are officially giving into their passions. You saw hints of this earlier on in the show. You saw it where they were having that boxing scene and Daphne was watching Simon as he was rolling up his sleeves. Or that scene, I think they were having ice cream and she saw him licking the spoon. And then you saw regarding when he was teaching her certain things that she can do in her bedroom by herself. Like, you see certain things going on regarding their passions for each other and how it's being explored. But you also see how that anger that they had towards each other, that frustration that they had for each other at that moment, it really was a deeper form of passion compared to others. It is from that combination of anger and sexual desire that these two engage in that moment of passion. But I believe that another distinction with this is that typically what I've noticed is that whenever they engage in passion, disaster always strikes like immediately afterwards. So for example, with Daphne and Simon, they finally engage in their desire. They engage in their passion for each other before Anthony finds them in that garden. And then as a result, his friendship with Simon is ultimately tainted, and he and Simon end up having to face in a duel for Daphne's honor. This moment is an example of how the garden is being used as a site of passion and for the exploration of passion. This is later reinforced by moments of further exploration between the two once they become a married couple. You can even include the moment in which Colin proposes to Lady Marina in another garden area. I believe it was still the Queen's, like somewhere near the Queen's palace, but he ended up proposing to Marina there, showing his own fortitude to the exploration of passion for the woman that he adored at the moment in time. We're going to get back to Colin in a moment. Now, in season 2, we have Anthony Bridgerton and Kate Sharma, who are another couple who have also given into their passion after much struggle. Their anger was another indication, similar to Daphne and Simon, that drove them to release the passion that they felt for one another in that gazebo on the Bridgerton property. The gazebo, as well as its location on the outskirts of the property in the field. This area, although it's not a garden per se, it was riddled with different flowers and plants that reinforced that they were indeed outside when this exploration occurred. So it can be assumed, even though it wasn't a garden, because there was so much flowers and there was so much foliage, it still can be given the same emphasis and same importance, same level of importance that the regular garden would have as well. I believe for this couple, it is all the more evident of the use of the garden as a metaphor for passion, because though they did relatively give into their passions in that church, they still went back to that level of distinguishedness, I guess. I don't think that's a word, but they went back to a level of self-control, and they still maintained that level of self-control throughout the majority of the show until they were found alone by themselves in the garden. And it's funny because if we go back to the first season, that is something that was often said about the Queen's Garden. However, in this one, it kind of does have a it does have a resemblance to it if you think about it, mainly because these two were by themselves alone in a garden-like setting, similar to how Daphne and Simon were alone in a dark setting, in a garden-like setting in the Queen's Garden. Though the Queen's Garden was the one that had that understanding, or that story of there always being a couple being caught in their engaging in passions because it seems so like hidden from society. It gives a sense of like a safe haven for couples, that a garden would be that safe haven for them in a way. Those are just my thoughts though. So regarding the season 2 passion giving in, and the two finally relinquishing their control over their desires and finally giving into their passions. When earlier I had spoken on the fact that whenever these passions are engaged in, there's always seems to be destruction like right next door. With this example, it would be regarding the fact that Kate was riding on her horse and she ended up falling and hitting her head. And as a result, Anthony could not see her for the longest time because she needed to rest, and he was praying and hoping that she would be fine. Ultimately, she was, but I would say that that's another example of how destruction came right after the engagement of this passion, like the gauging of this forbidden passion they shouldn't be engaging in. The only reason why it was fine afterwards was because she ended up being fine, and she ended up giving into her desire to be with him and all that stuff. So yeah, that was that second season. Now, with the Queen Charlotte spinoff. With regard to Queen Charlotte and King George's romance, I believe that their passion is depicted a little different, and it's pretty interesting how it's depicted because it's not anywhere close to how the others are depicted, but the garden is still a very pivotal metaphor within the season as well. There are 2 areas in which this passion is being depicted. However, I think what is unique with this season is that regarding the passion that the queen and the king feel for one another, in these specific scenes where passion is being depicted, it's, I would say, passion that is diverted from one another. It's not directly towards one another. I'll explain in a second. So the first depiction of this passion was when the queen was trying to jump over the garden wall. Her passion was to be over that wall. There was passion there, and there was a meeting between 2 people. So it was her and King George, and that was when her interest was sparked towards King George because she didn't know who he was, and everyone was being very like shady about it, and they were kind of brushing off her concerns. So she decided that she was going to try to jump over the wall, and King George came and pretty much put her mind at ease. So she understood, okay, this is who I'm supposed to be marrying. Okay, it might not be that bad. One thing I would say with this scene is that passion was definitely depicted in the scene. However, it wasn't passion for the king. This was passion for her to escape. And I think what can be noted is that in this passion towards escape, we see her being framed within the garden walls. So we can really emphasize the fact that there was a passion there that she was feeling at a very strong fortitude for. However, when she ended up meeting the king, she made a decision to ultimately go with him. And ultimately, when disaster struck for this scene, we see her regretting getting married to him in the first place because of his insistence of him going back to Q and the queen staying in her home, her new home, away from the king. So for the second example of passions being depicted, the second depiction would be regarding the king when he was entering his psychosis. So if you guys remember, the queen had just made it known to the king that she was pregnant. She was bearing his first child, and he ended up having a psychotic break, I think that evening that he found out. And as a result of that, he ended up running into the garden and ended up stripping bare in front of Venus and was shouting his love and his affection and his desire for Venus, for her to come down and to greet him. And I believe that this is another prime example of how, yes, those two did have passion for each other. They did love each other. They did care for each other. However, their passions for one another was never, I won't say it was never like boisterous like how the others were. However, these passions, they showed you how much of an emphasis there was on each of these passions, you know? So for the king, his passion here was ultimately so much for Venus. And remember, Queen Charlotte, she ended up putting Venus onto her when she ended up meeting the king. She told him, I am Venus. And I feel like, though I don't think it would be easily dissuaded in that regard, I feel like that might have been a part of it, where his desire ended up being towards Charlotte at the end. We saw it in the second season when Kate Sharma's sister, I can't remember her name, but when she was getting married and they had to go confront the queen because she realized that she ran out of the wedding and all that stuff. And then the king came in and he was going through his psychosis again. And at that moment, they were able to calm him down, essentially. And the sister was saying how the queen would make a beautiful bride and all that beautiful, like, it was a really touching scene. I believe from that example, it can be evident that his desire is towards the queen. However, I do believe that within his psychosis that he is especially passionate, especially just in that scene alone. That scene alone showed, for me at least, that he was very passionate in his psychosis towards a goddess, you know? So yeah, there's that as an example as well. Another thing that I noticed within that exchange, those two exchanges, is that it could also be insinuated that the direction in which the two were looking when the other was having their passion, it could be that was ultimately the viewer's passion as well. So for example, so I can make myself a little bit more clear, when we had Queen Charlotte trying to jump over the wall, if you watched the frames video that I did, I made it mentioned, or I made it known, that there's a distinct angle that the producer and the director purposely chose to make us, the viewer, look at the scene. So when the queen was attempting to jump over the wall, we saw her from behind. So we saw her pacing back and forth. And if you guys if you have seen the video, then you would know that when I was acknowledging the scene, I was stating that it looked as though we were being kicked out of the scene and we were looking through someone else's eyes. Later on, we found out that it was King George whose eyes we were looking through. Now, if we were to jump forward, when King George is having his own passionate moment, his own psychosis, we see Queen Charlotte running with his right hand. I cannot remember anyone's names, but we see the queen running with his right hand to go after the king. And there was a angle there. I never really acknowledged it, but I acknowledged it recently when I was thinking of how to write this video. We see the ways in which the camera pans around the garden wall, I believe. I think it was a garden wall. The way that we pan around to see him stripping bare in that garden, that showed it as though we were looking through Queen Charlotte's eyes. I never noticed it before. I thought it was really interesting. So I kind of wanted to make it known. But it could be depicted that there were two types of passion there. There was a passion for Queen Charlotte to be with her husband, and then ultimately seeing the psychosis that he was going through. And then in the first scene, we see King George seeing his future bride, realizing who she is afterwards, or possibly seeing a beautiful woman trying to escape a wall and ultimately falling in love with her the moment that he sees her. And he does reinforce that idea later on when he confesses his love for Charlotte and says, ever since I saw you trying to climb over the wall, I knew that I've always loved you, essentially. So yeah, there's that scene as well. So now for the main event, we have Colin and Penelope. Now, the reason why I am very disappointed within this storytelling is because with this story, I will go back to that example with the kissing scene. We are in the garden of the Featherington home. Can't really tell it's a garden. It's probably just me. Maybe I'm just being silly, but I didn't really understand where we were at the time. I didn't realize or recognize that we were in the garden per se. I just thought that we were at the side of the house or something. I knew it wasn't the front, but I didn't think we were in the garden. I don't know why, but that's just me. Colin and Penelope finally engaged in their first kiss, and then that was it for that. We get to... what else happens? There's another scene where they go under a willow tree to kind of like engage with each other after the whole secret of her using Colin to find a husband. Hey everyone, it's editor Rissa here. I realized in this section I said a whole bunch of nothing without really explaining myself properly, so we're going to do our explanation here. So essentially what I'm trying to get at is that when Colin and Penelope have their first kiss, there was no disaster afterwards because the disaster already occurred. The disaster was that everyone found out that Penelope was using Colin in order for her to become more attractive in the eyes of men, and Colin was willingly helping her. So that was the biggest disaster. And then from that disaster, it led to them having a relationship with one another. And the biggest issue with that scene is that, unlike the rest, where the disaster pretty much occurs afterwards and they have to work through it as a couple, in this one, it was very disjointed and was very separate. So we have Colin and Penelope pretty much engaging in this kiss from Penelope's desperation to not want to be a spinster anymore, and Colin doesn't really have any motivation to not do it. Like, he could say that, oh yeah, we're just friends, like I don't want to ruin our friendship, but then for Penelope it was like, no, I don't want to ever have to live a life where I've never been kissed. So he fulfilled that, and then they left it alone. But then that's where his possession of her starts to form. And I feel like it was such an unnecessary story plot to utilize when they were already building and crafting a storyline that pretty much reinforced the Pygmalion effect. That really would have moved the story forward in a better light compared to what they decided to do. When it came to the utilization of gardens within the scene, again with that scene where they kissed for the first time, really and truly you couldn't really see anything. You knew it was outside, so maybe it can give the benefit of the doubt. They were outside, you're able to tell they were outside, so ultimately you could say that there was a form of passion there. But then again, the issue I have is that for other scenes, like for the Queen Charlotte scene, there was passion there. Everyone had a passion for the other person, or someone had the passion for the other person. Penelope didn't I guess she did have a passion for Colin still, but even then, I feel like in this season, they were really trying to emphasize that she really wasn't caring about him. I don't know. It just wasn't really efficient. But yes, if you guys have stayed to this end of this video, I really appreciate it. I know it was all over the place. I don't think everything was as concise as I wanted it to be, but I really appreciate you guys spending the time to just watch the video. If you guys enjoyed it, if you guys want to see more, I would suggest liking or just subscribing, turning on the notifications just so you know when the next video will come out. And I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, my loves.